snow whispered over the valley like a long-forgotten hymn. The wind carried ghosts that night. Ghosts of unspoken regret, of promises left unfulfilled. Officer Silas Halloway could hear them even over the hum of his patrol truck, their murmurs threading through the static of the radio. The world outside was swallowed whole by white, the kind of storm that makes even the living feel buried. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned forward, trying to make sense of the shape on the horizon. Out here on the far edge of town, time had a slower pulse. Every mile of snow looked the same, endless, heavy, beautiful in a way that hurt. He'd been assigned the winter shift after the accident, an unspoken punishment wrapped in professionalism. The sheriff never said it aloud, but everyone in town knew. Silas had lost his partner, and with him a piece of his name. The storm took him, they'd whisper, but guilt kept Silas out there. He carried that silence like a badge no one could see. Tonight was supposed to be routine. A drive through the outskirts, check the back roads, report the drift levels. Nothing human should be wandering these parts in a blizzard. Nothing, he thought, until his headlights caught a flicker of motion against the snow. He braked hard, tires groaning against the ice. For a moment, everything blurred. White snow, yellow beams, the sound of the wind pressing its face against the glass. Then the figure appeared again, low and deliberate. A dog, moving through the storm as if pulled by some unseen purpose. Silas stepped out of the truck, his breath instantly stolen by the cold. He called out, his voice barely reaching the creature. It turned, half its face marked with scars that looked too old to be new, too deep to forget. The dog's eyes glowed amber under the patrol lights, wild and wary. It didn't run, but it didn't trust either. "Easy, boy," Silas murmured, his voice breaking against the wind. He reached for his flashlight, angling the beam low so it wouldn't blind the animal. Snow clung to the fur like dusted glass. The shepherd stood guard over something buried, a small, uneven mound. At first, Silas thought it might be a carcass, but when he stepped closer, he saw fabric, an old blanket, stiff from frost, wrapped around something fragile. His chest tightened. He crouched, slow, steady. The dog growled, not out of hate, but warning. Beneath the blanket, a shape barely larger than a loaf of bread. A wooden toy, its paint faded, the edges worn by years of small hands. Silas froze. The sight struck like a pulse from the past. He remembered the last call before the storm years ago. The missing child, the snow, the way he'd promised they'd find her by dawn. They never did. His hands trembled as he re-wrapped the toy, the dog's low growl softening to a whimper. "You're guarding it," Silas whispered. "All this time." He looked at the creature again, at the scars cutting across its flank. A survivor, a sentinel. Something about its stillness made the air feel sacred, like he had stumbled into a secret that wasn't meant to be found. The wind picked up, flinging stinging flakes into his eyes. He knew the dog would die if left here. Its ribs showed through the fur, its paws raw from the ice. He took off his glove and held out his bare hand, fingers trembling in the cold. "Come on now, let's get you warm." The dog hesitated. Minutes passed, stretched long as hours. Finally, it stepped forward, not trusting, but surrendering to something older than fear. When its nose brushed Silas's palm, he felt a strange jolt of warmth, a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. He wrapped the blanket around the dog, lifting it carefully into his arms. It was heavier than it looked, all muscle and exhaustion. Inside the patrol truck, the heater wheezed weakly, fogging the windows. Silas kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the dog, who lay curled on the passenger seat, eyes half closed. The storm followed them back, relentless. He couldn't shake the image of the toy, the way the dog had stood watch, as though waiting for someone who would never return. Something about that devotion cut deeper than the cold. By the time he reached the cabin on the outskirts of town, the one he used for winter patrols, night had settled like a thick shroud. The power flickered once, then steadied. He carried the shepherd inside, laying it near the fire. The animal stirred but didn't move away. Silas found an old towel and began drying its fur, careful around the scars. Each mark told a story he didn't know. Stories of fights survived, winters endured, promises kept. The firelight glowed against the dog's face, softening its edges. "Ashen," Silas murmured. The name came unbidden, rising from somewhere deep. The dog opened one eye, as if acknowledging it. "Ashen it is." He sat beside the fire, boots thawing, heart heavy. Outside, the storm howled against the windows, a chorus of unfinished songs. Ashen lifted his head, watching him, reading him in a way only a creature who has known pain could. Silas poured a little broth into a bowl and slid it across the floor. Ashen sniffed, then drank in slow, careful sips. When he finished, he crawled closer to the fire, his body easing into rest. Silas watched until his own eyes grew heavy. The world outside was still chaos, but in that small circle of warmth, there was peace. Fragile, borrowed, but real. Morning came as pale light through frosted glass. The storm had eased, leaving the world draped in silence. Silas stepped outside, breath hanging like smoke, the snow waist-deep and blindingly white. The quiet after a blizzard felt almost holy. When he turned back, Ashen was standing at the door, his gaze fixed on the distant ridge. There was something searching in it, like memory stirring. Silas felt the same pull in his chest. The town still slept, but its whispers would wake soon enough. He knew what they'd say when they learned he brought the ghost dog home. Later, at the station, Sheriff Corbett raised an eyebrow. "You found him out there?" His tone balanced disbelief and warning. Silas nodded, recounting the basics but omitting the blanket, the toy, the feeling. Some truths were too delicate to hand over. The sheriff rubbed his jaw. "You know folks'll talk. They think that dog's cursed, part of what happened last time." Silas said nothing. He'd lived long enough under gossip's shadow to recognize its bite. "Let him talk," he finally said, voice low. "He's just cold and hungry." That evening, the vet nurse arrived. A woman with quiet eyes and a gentleness that reminded Silas of warmth long gone. Mara Quinn. She stepped inside without flinching at the cold or the sight of the scarred dog at her feet. "He trusts you," she said softly, kneeling beside Ashen. "That's rare." Her fingers brushed the animal's fur, and for a moment, the cabin felt less lonely. Silas didn't know how to answer, so he nodded. Words seemed too clumsy beside her calm. She worked in silence, tending to the wounds, her face close to the firelight. The smell of herbs filled the air, mingling with pine and smoke. When she left, she paused at the door. "Keep him near the fire tonight. His scars aren't just skin deep." After she was gone, Silas sat by the hearth again. Ashen shifted closer, resting his muzzle on Silas's boot. Outside, snow began to fall once more, softer now, like memory instead of punishment. Silas watched the flakes drift past the window, each one catching the light before vanishing into darkness. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. There was something about the dog's breathing, steady and warm, that filled the empty spaces inside him. He didn't understand it yet, but he felt it, the fragile thread of connection forming in the quiet between heartbeats. Before sleep took him, he whispered to the room, to the fire, to the storm that never seemed to end. "Whatever you were guarding, I'll keep safe now." The dog stirred, and for a fleeting instant, its eyes opened, calm, knowing, ancient. It was as though Ashen understood every word. The night settled into stillness. Beyond the cabin walls, the world was blanketed in silence, the kind that holds its breath before a truth begins to surface. And though he didn't yet know it, Silas had just stepped into the heart of his own redemption. The storm had not led him astray, but back to where his soul had been waiting all along. The storm had left behind a silence so deep it seemed to breathe. Snow lay heavy on the eaves, glittering like crushed glass in the faint morning light. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, its glow reduced to a faint pulse among the embers. Silas stirred awake in his chair, the ache in his back familiar, the quiet foreign. Ashen still slept near the hearth, his body curved around the warmth like a question mark. For a moment, Silas simply watched the dog breathe, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, as if he were proof that life, no matter how scarred, endured. Mara returned that afternoon, her boots leaving soft prints across the snow. She carried supplies wrapped in brown paper and the faint scent of pine. When Silas opened the door, she smiled, not out of politeness but something gentler, as if she understood the language of solitude. "He's mending," she said, setting down her things. Ashen lifted his head, tail thudding once against the floor. Mara knelt, unwrapping gauze and a small tin of salve. "There's memory in his eyes," she murmured. "Not just instinct." Silas nodded, though the words stayed caught somewhere in his chest. He watched her hands move, sure, kind, careful, as though tending the creature mended something invisible in her too. They didn't speak much after that. Silence became their form of trust. She stayed long enough to sip coffee, her eyes sometimes finding the scar along Silas's jaw, the one he never explained. When she left, she placed her hand on the doorframe and said softly, "Keep listening. Animals remember things we forget." Then she was gone, the snow swallowing her footsteps, leaving Silas with the sound of wind and his own unspoken thoughts. That night, Ashen began pacing, restless. His body trembled with some instinct Silas couldn't read. He pushed at the door with his nose, whining softly. "Easy, boy," Silas said. But there was urgency in the animal's eyes. Finally, he opened the door, and the shepherd darted into the storm dark, his form vanishing against the white. Silas cursed under his breath, grabbed his coat, and followed. The air was sharp enough to cut. Each step sank knee-deep, the cold biting through his boots. Ashen's tracks glowed faintly in the moonlight, leading north toward the ridge, the same direction as the abandoned mill. As he trudged forward, the wind howled through the trees, bending the pines into prayerful shapes. His breath came in ragged bursts. When he reached the mill, its skeleton rose out of the snow like a ruin from another life. The dog stood by the entrance, motionless, tail low, waiting. Silas approached slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "What is it, Ashen?" The beams swept over the collapsed roof, the broken beams, the drifted snow piled high against one corner. And then he saw it, half buried beneath frost and timber, a wooden cross. Crude, hand-carved. The badge nailed to it had dulled with time, but still caught the faint light. Silas's heart clenched. He knew that badge. He had polished it once for morning inspection, back when laughter still lived in his chest. It was his partner's. His breath stuttered out of him, visible as vapor in the frozen air. "No," he whispered. The name etched into the badge blurred through the tears that filled his eyes. Beside the cross, partly hidden beneath the snow, lay the same wooden toy from the night he found Ashen. The realization struck like lightning through the cold. The dog had been guarding this grave. For years, through every storm, through hunger, through pain, through the long loneliness of memory. Silas fell to his knees, the snow swallowing the sound of his breath. "You stayed," he murmured, looking at the dog. "You never left him." Ashen stepped forward, pressing his head against Silas's shoulder. The warmth of that touch broke something open inside him. All the guilt he had carried, the weight of his partner's death, the years of silence, spilled out in quiet sobs that the snow absorbed without judgment. "I should have found you sooner," he said, voice breaking. "I should have come back." The wind seemed to soften, as if even the storm understood the language of grief. Mara's lantern appeared in the distance, swinging softly like a star. She had followed his trail through the dark, her face flushed from cold and worry. "Silas!" she called, her voice trembling with both fear and relief. When she reached him, she saw the grave, the badge, the dog. Understanding came without words. She set the lantern in the snow, its glow wrapping them in a small circle of gold. "He remembered for you," she whispered. Silas looked at her then, not as a stranger, not even as the quiet woman who helped a wounded animal, but as someone who saw him without needing to ask. Her eyes reflected the firelight of forgiveness, and for the first time in years, he could meet another gaze without shame. They stayed there for a long while, the three of them, man, woman, and dog, bound by something deeper than speech. The snow eased to a gentle drift, flakes landing softly on their hair, melting into warmth before they could linger. Silas reached out and brushed the snow from the cross, tracing the letters with his thumb. "You can rest now," he whispered. Though he wasn't sure if he spoke to his partner or himself, the night felt sacred, every breath a kind of prayer. When they finally turned back, Ashen walked ahead, his gait steady, his scars silver under the moonlight. By the time they returned to the cabin, dawn was breaking. The horizon blushed with a faint amber glow. Inside, Silas stoked the fire back to life while Mara dried her gloves by the stove. Neither spoke, but something in the air had shifted, a peace too fragile to name. Ashen lay by the hearth again, eyes half closed, sighing as if the burden he'd carried for years had finally lifted. Silas sat beside him, his hand resting lightly on the dog's back. The warmth beneath his palm was alive, real, forgiving. Mara glanced around the cabin, at the simple things. A kettle on the stove, a photograph face down on the table, boots thawing by the door. "You could make this place into something," she said softly. "A refuge, maybe, for the ones who've been left behind." He turned to her, and though no words rose immediately, he nodded. It felt right, to turn pain into shelter, to honor the past by saving what remained. She smiled, small and tired. "Ashen's Haven," she said, almost teasing. The name hung in the air, and even the fire seemed to approve. Later, when Mara left to tell the sheriff about the grave, Silas stood outside watching the horizon. The world was waking, the first rays of sunlight touching the snow until it looked like fields of light instead of ice. He could hear distant bells from town, the faint echo of morning chores, life continuing. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The air was sharp but clean, unburdened. When he turned back, Ashen was watching him through the window, tail thudding once against the floor, as if to remind him that not all endings are loss. Some are simply transformations, days turn to weeks. The gossip in town faded, replaced by murmurs of curiosity. People began visiting the cabin, an injured fox, a stray cat, a hound with a limp. Mara helped him care for them, her laughter sometimes breaking the quiet like birdsong in spring. They said little about what had happened at the mill. Some truths needed no retelling. In the evenings, Silas would sit by the fire, Ashen's head resting on his knee, Mara reading softly from an old book. The cabin, once a place of exile, had become something like a heartbeat. One night, as snow fell again outside, Silas stood at the window, watching the flakes drift past the lantern light. The world seemed suspended, caught between silence and song. Behind him, Mara hummed a tune, and Ashen shifted closer to the fire, content. Silas thought of his partner's grave, of the years lost to guilt, and of the strange mercy that had led him back through the storm. He realized that redemption doesn't always arrive with fanfare. It comes quietly, through small acts, through forgiveness freely given by those who never owed it. He stepped outside for a moment, the cold brushing his skin like a reminder of where he'd begun. The sky stretched wide, filled with soft falling light. He whispered to the air, "Thank you for finding me." And somewhere, he swore he heard an echo, not from the heavens, but from the steady, loyal heart beating inside the cabin. He turned back, snow crunching beneath his boots, and paused at the door to look once more at the horizon. The dawn was breaking again, brighter than before. Inside, Mara looked up as he entered, her smile small but steady. Ashen lifted his head, tail tapping the floor once, twice. Silas closed the door, sealing in the warmth. The firelight flickered across their faces, golden and soft. Outside, the world continued its quiet thaw, winter surrendering to the promise of another beginning. Somewhere in the voice of memory, Elder Alowan's whisper carried through the years, soft as snowfall. In every storm, something waits to be found. And sometimes it isn't what we seek that saves us, but what never stopped waiting. If you've ever been lost in your own blizzard, remember this. There's always something guarding the light for you, patient as loyalty, warm as forgiveness. And if this tale reached you in some quiet corner of your heart, stay a little longer. Subscribe and let the next whispered tale find you where words can still heal.